How were 19th-century German idealists different from Plato or George Berkeley?
Before the 19th century, idealism tended to be a train of thought in individual writers who posited the existence of unseen entities and claimed greater reality for them than the things in the world that could be sensed. Except for Plotinus, 205 to 270, and other Neoplatonists. Idealism before the 19th century was limited to positing entities or structures that existed in a separate realm, independently of perceived reality, as humans perceive reality. The 19th century idealists, in contrast, posited ideal entities and structures and also described their functions in ways that directly influenced the perceived world and events within it. A medical analogy is that before the 19th century, idealists were like philosophical anatomists. Whereas in the 19th century, idealists also worked as philosophical physiologists. This last is especially true of Friedrich Hegel, 1770 to 1831, although he could not have constructed his system without Immanuel Kant's 1724 to 1804 work before him, and the directions in which Johann Gottlieb Fichte 1762 to 1814, and Friedrich Schelling, 1775 to 1854, tried to take Kant's work.
What was Michel Foucault's method for forming his cultural criticism?
Foucault studied institutions and ideas by understanding their histories. In the course of that anthropological archaeology, he often pinpointed the emergence of new forms of human discourse and personal identity. In the case of sexuality, for example, Foucault argued that new forms of power create new forms of sexuality, as do new practices of observation and medical diagnosis. One of Foucault's most enduring contributions was to demonstrate how many human traits and practices that are believed to be natural are in fact the effects of social and political institutions that exert unexamined power on individuals. At the same time, the individuals are complicit in remaking themselves to conform to institutional expectations. A primary example would be ideas of gender such as athletic ability in women. Before the second half of the 20th century, women were believed to be unable to participate or excel in sports due to natural limitations. Foucault is famous for having claimed to invert Plato, c. 428 c. 348 BCE, who had said that the soul is imprisoned in the body, meaning that our natural physical needs and desires oppress our higher spiritual selves. Foucault thought that the soul is the prison of the body, meaning that our ideas shape our physical existence.
Who was Pierre-Joseph Proudhon?
Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, 1809 to 1865, was the French social theorist who coined the word anarchism.
What was Mary Estelle's contribution to early modern philosophy?
Mary Estelle, 1666–1731, used Descartes' ideas to criticize custom, insisting that tradition itself is not a sufficient justification for the subordinate position of married women. She wrote, that the custom of the world, has put women, generally speaking, into a state of subjection, is not denied, but the right can no more be proved from the fact. Then the predominancy of vice can justify it. This willingness to criticize custom in the service of an unpopular claim was an important intellectual innovation. Estelle was interested in the use of reason as an innate capacity of women. She argued that women could find their own religious salvation, intellectually as well as morally. The target of her argument was the prevailing practice of not offering women the same education as men. In her A Serious Proposal to the Ladies, 1694, she proposed a college for upper class women that would prepare them for intellectual activities and religious services. Her claim was that the faults attributed to women could be corrected through education.
Why has there been a third wave in feminism?
According to its critics, the second wave was presumed to speak for all women while it merely propounded the interests of a small group of white, privileged American intellectual women.
What were the shared goals of the St. Louis Hegelians?
Although Friedrich Hegel, 1770–1831, was chosen as the guide for the group by Henry C. Brockmeyer, 1826–1906, their interests were not so much in theoretical abstractions as in understanding their own life and times, particularly the U.S. Civil War. According to Denton Jacques Snyder, 1841–1925, their goals were to philosophize practical life, to be able to give a rational account of their vocations, and achieve self-realization. They also wanted to contribute to the future greatness of society. Philosophy for them was closer to a religious practice than an academic one.
What is ethical, or moral, relativism?
There are two kinds. Descriptive moral relativism is the view that different cultures have different moral beliefs. Prescriptive or normative moral relativism is the view that the whole of what's right is what people in a given society think is right. The result of this view is that moral disagreement can't be rationally debated.
What, besides ethics, is philosophical about environmentalism?
As mortal beings, we are all dependent on our environments. And a good part of human spirituality is centered on gratitude for how the earth supports human life, as well as the beauty of natural living and non-living things. Overall, environmentalism has encouraged a reverence for the goods of life and a good life that flows from what is not artificial or man-made and mass-produced. There are, of course, direct practical human concerns when it comes to environmentalism, as well as quality of life issues related to diminishing resources. For example, not all of the multidisciplinary experts who have studied global warming agree on its dangers or on how much of it is due to human fossil fuel consumption. Some believe that Earth has had similar changes in temperature before human industrialization. Recent and emerging studies assign high percentages of global warming to the flatulence of domestic animals raised for food, which could be considered an indirect human activity. Sorting out an issue as complex as global warming would require extensive philosophy of science.
How were Friedrich Schelling's views of culture aesthetic?
Schelling believed that history is a drama that will be resolved when the absolute discloses itself. God is an artist, the universe his artwork. The main value of religion lies not in its morality, but in its beauty.
How did Johannes Kepler's career develop?
Kepler, 1571–1630, studied astronomy and was prepared to become a Lutheran minister. When he was appointed a mathematician at the University of Graz. At that time, mathematics included both astronomy and astrology. In 1596 he published the Mysterium Cosmographium, which was the first comprehensive work on astronomy that was based on the Copernican system. At the time, Graz was dominated by Catholics, and Kepler had to flee on religious grounds, because he was a Protestant. He went to Prague, where Tycho Brahe, 1546–1601, the famous observational astronomer, had an observatory. Kepler composed a defense of Brahe's observations against Nicolaus Ursus, who had attacked them as mere hypothesis. Kepler also claimed that, in addition to merely selecting the Ptolemaic or Copernican system, independent physical explanations are necessary. Using Tycho's observational data, Kepler then began work on the orbit of Mars. After Tycho died, Kepler was given his position as imperial mathematician, and also complete access to all of Tycho's data. In 1609 Kepler published a new astronomy based on causes or a physics of the sky. Kepler then had to leave Prague for the same reasons he had fled Graz. After he went to Linz, His research included music, theology, and philosophy, in addition to mathematics, which included astronomy. In his 1612 Epitome Astronomia Copernicani he again emphasized the importance of causal explanation, as well as observational predictions, in studies of the movements of the planets. His 1618 Harmonia Mundi was the final expression of this thought. He said of this work, "It can wait a century for a reader, as God himself has waited 6,000 years for a witness." Kepler was not the last great astronomer to believe he had special information about God. Isaac Newton's 1643 to 1727 work was to take the same high tone.
Ayre's version of logical positivism.
In Language, Truth, and Logic, 1936, published when he was just 26. Ayre forcefully and with great panache presented the main tenets of logical positivism as a doctrine broadly relevant to philosophy. He asserted the empiricist doctrine that all of our knowledge of the world comes from sensory experience. The truth or falsity of statements was dependent on whether they could be verified in terms of that experience. Only statements that could be true or false were meaningful. It followed from these bold claims that metaphysical, religious, and ethical statements, if they were not true by definition, could assert nothing meaningful about reality. Statements about the self, the external world, and the minds of others had to be confirmed by sensory experience, if they were to be meaningful. Concerning the existence of God, for example, Ayre maintained that the question itself was not meaningful because no possible experience could determine its truth or falsity. Ayre's ethical theory was emotivist, that is, ethical judgments were held to be expressions of emotions.
Who was Josiah Royce?
Josiah Royce, 1855 to 1916, is known as an absolute pragmatist. He sought to combine German and British absolute idealism with American pragmatism. Royce was born in Grass Valley, California, which, at the time following the gold rush, was a mining town. His family moved to San Francisco when he was 11 and he graduated from the University of California in 1875. He then received a PhD from Johns Hopkins University in 1878. Royce also studied at universities in Leipzig and Göttingen, after which he taught English at the University of California for 4 years. In 1882, he was invited to join Harvard's philosophy department, where he eventually became a professor and led a highly acclaimed and distinguished career. Royce's major publications are The World and the Individual, 1899. Sources of Religious Insight, 1912, The Problem of Christianity, 1913, War and Insurance, 1914. The Hope of the Great Community, 1916, and Lectures on Modern Idealism, 1919. Also available is Royce's Logical Essays, Collected Logical Essays of Josiah Royce, 1951.
What was Confucius' influence?
Confucius was the most highly regarded teacher, moralist, and poet in Chinese history. Mencius, 372–289 BCE, the most prominent Confucian philosopher after Confucius himself, held that all human beings are born with moral inclinations. Mencius' teachings have persisted as the dominant form of Confucianism to the present time. Sun Tzu, c. 312–230 BCE, taught Confucianism as a way of following formal hierarchical social structures to achieve personal happiness. For additional information on the teachings and history of Confucianism, refer to Xinzongyao and Hsin Chengyao, An Introduction to Confucianism, 2000. And Chengying Cheng, New Dimensions of Confucian and Neo-Confucian Philosophy, 1991.
What is the Lens Crafters Society?
While the members of the American Philosophical Association, APA, in the 20th and early 21st centuries have been, for the most part, employed as academic philosophers, not everyone with a Ph.D. in philosophy is able to find work as a professor, and some of them do not have other jobs, either. The APA has tried to accommodate these unemployed philosophers at its annual meetings, and it sponsors an organization for them that is called the Lens Crafters Society. In honor of Spinoza, who polished lenses for a living.
Why were ideas important to Berkeley?
An idea in this sense is a technical term, meaning some discrete thing in the mind. Berkeley's metaphysics began with the assumption that all we ever know are our ideas, which are in our minds. This is one reason why ideas are so important. We tend to assume that if we have a word for something, then we have an idea of it. But sometimes we fool ourselves, and our words are just empty with no ideas behind them. Therefore, we need to make sure that we actually have the ideas we think we have. Just because we are accustomed to using language in certain ways, does not mean that all words that are intelligible to us refer to ideas. If we reflect on abstract, general words, such as man, whiteness, animal, or matter, it becomes evident that there is nothing in the mind to which these words refer. All of our ideas are about particulars or combinations of particulars. We lack the capacity to create new ideas. Only God can do that, although we are able to combine existing ideas in new ways and create copies of existing ideas.
Was John Stuart Mill a socialist or a capitalist?
In applying the principles of utility to government and social institutions, Mill recognized the productive consequences of free markets. But he thought that public ownership of production might benefit a greater number by eliminating the extremes of poverty. He believed in democratic government, provided that citizens were well informed and it was not a simple majority rule based on emotions.
How did Lamblichus practice Neoplatonism?
Lamblichus of Syria, c. 245 to 325, was a student of Porphyry's. 233 to 309, who set up his own school in Apamea, in what is modern Syria. Porphyry had practiced theurgy or magic based on vegetarianism and other physical restrictions. But he thought the effectiveness of theurgy was limited to lower levels of spiritual ascent. Lamblichus developed a more elaborate system of theurgy for every stage of salvation, which was similar to Christian sacramental theology and became an integral part of Neoplatonism from then on. Lamblichus also embellished Plotinus' system, dividing the one into two. One responsible for the creation and the other transcending it. The Roman Emperor Julian, c. 331 to 363, became interested in Lamblichus' system. After Lamblichus incorporated many of the Greek gods into Plotinian descriptions of creation and salvation.
Did Aristotle think that morality had a purpose or final cause?
Yes. Aristotle thought that in human life as in nature, generally everything has a purpose and there cannot be an infinite regress of purposes. That is, there is an unmoved mover, because we are goal-directed. There must be some goal that is valuable to us in itself, and not because it will lead to some other goal. The goal that is good in and of itself is happiness. Aristotle thought that happiness is not pleasure or any other feeling, but a quality that settles over life when we are actualizing our essence by behaving virtuously for the right reasons. Our essence is our rationality.
How did W. V. Quine naturalize epistemology?
He did not think that knowledge could have a foundation apart from science, and that instead of philosophical epistemology there should be a scientific explanation of how we construct our web of knowledge and why and how that web is successful. Quine had a flexible view of knowledge and thought that theoretical terms did not have definite or fixed meanings, that translation was indeterminate, and that it was unclear how words referred to objects.
What was Plato's academy?
Sometime between the early 380s and 367 CE, Plato founded the academy in Athens, where he lived. Plato's academy provided higher education to sons of the aristocracy. It was different from Isocrates, c. 436 c. 393 BCE, school, which formalized the teachings of the sophists in politics and rhetoric for the practical aim of training lawyers. Plato's students, on the other hand, were taught mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy. Aristotle entered the academy when he was 17. And in his early 20s added the subject of rhetoric to the curriculum. Plato's academy was probably co-founded by Theaetetus, 417 to 369 BCE. After whom Plato named a dialogue, and Eudacus, c. 408 c. 347 BCE. Astronomer and mathematician. Lectures were given to seated students who took notes. There were probably never more than 100 students in attendance at a time. And it is not certain that Plato himself lectured there.
What was John Stuart Mill's view of logic and scientific methodology?
Foremost, Mill argued that deductive logic does not depend on intuition for its proof, but rather on internal consistency. The foundational assumptions or axioms of all sciences are based on experience. Even the shared scientific axiom that nature is uniform or law-like is proved through simple enumeration of confirming examples, that is, through induction. More specific causal explanations do no more than summarize necessary and sufficient conditions. A necessary condition is always present when the effect occurs. The effect is always present when a sufficient condition is present. For example, a bullet to the brain is sufficient to cause death in most cases. But it is not necessary because people die from other causes. Or, oxygen is necessary to cause fire. But it is not sufficient because fire requires friction and combustible material, as well as oxygen. Mill also thought that the basic principles of arithmetic and geometry could be proved by induction. He agreed with Isidore Marie Auguste François Xavier Comte, 1798 to 1857, about a unified view of the social sciences, whereby the laws for more general sciences could be derived from what is known about more specific sciences. For example, observations of individual human behavior could result in a science of psychology. And observations of individual psychology could result in a science of society or sociology. It should be noted that much subsequent theoretical work in mathematics and social science did not find Mill's ideas useful.
What are the other American philosophies?
The term here refers to philosophies that represent groups in the Americas that have been politically subordinate to the groups historically represented by the U.S. government. These philosophies themselves have long histories in their cultures of origin. But their concerns have recently become part of Anglo-American mainstream academic philosophy. As a result, new philosophical subfields emerged toward the end of the 20th century. African American, Native American, and Latin American philosophy. Each of these traditions has developed as a form of cultural criticism. And insofar as its analyses of oppression would not immediately be recognized as such by perpetrators, each is a distinctive critical theory.
What was Cambridge Platonism?
No discussion of 17th-century philosophy would be complete without at least mention of the Cambridge Platonists. The Cambridge Platonists were a loosely connected group of philosophers, theologians, and humanistic writers who resisted both the new science and rationalistic and empiricist attempts to base philosophy on it. Although they often were unaware of the content of the doctrines that they opposed. In spirit, they were closer to Neoplatonists, such as Plotinus, 205 to 270, and Proclus, 412 to 485, than to Plato, c. 428-c. 348 BCE, with healthy doses of Pythagoras, c. 570 to 495 BCE, and Marsilio Ficino, 1433 to 1499, as well as an interest in Hermes Trismegistus, a mythological figure based on the Egyptian god Thoth and the Greek god Hermes. The main Platonic influence on all the Cambridge Platonists was the idea of a perfect world beyond the senses, that was the cause of what we experience through our senses in this world. Those who were influenced by the Neoplatonists combined Christian beliefs with their basic Platonic view, such that the perfect Platonic world was ruled by a force or a deity, like God in Christianity. Their goal was to defend true religion against Calvinism, atheism, and mechanistic philosophers such as René Descartes, 1596 to 1650, and Thomas Hobbes, 1588 to 1679. The Cambridge Platonists were not influential for the central development of philosophy, but their individual contributions nonetheless lived on in intellectual life. The basic tenet of Cambridge Platonism was the obscure religious belief, first stated by the Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, 1463 to 1494, that both Pythagoras and Plato based their philosophy on teachings by Moses that were expressed in the Kabbalah and other facets of the Jewish mystical tradition. Their other beliefs affirmed God's existence, the soul's immortality, and the animation of the natural world by, or with, spirit. They were convinced both that man had free will and that reason was of primary importance in religious matters. However, they were not empiricists, because they believed in innate ideas and innate principles of morality and religion, which were recognizable through intuition. And furthermore, it needs to be kept in mind that not all of those known as Cambridge Neoplatonists shared the same views.
What is feminist philosophy of science?
Feminist philosophy of science consists of analyses of scientific methodology and standards for truth. Its focus has been on the ways that the idea of objectivity have excluded knowledge of importance to women.
How is environmentalism related to feminism?
Feminists have addressed the exploitation of natural environments as part of overall cultural misogyny insofar as the earth is at least metaphorically female. Also, some of the exploitation of animals is centered on female animals. Chris Cuomo explores this last thesis and characterizes living beings in an interesting way as having dynamic charm in feminism and ecological communities, 2002.
Did the study of some of the sciences get their start in philosophy?
Yes. Until the end of the 17th century, the physical sciences were called natural philosophy. And until the 19th century there were no social sciences. Social science work was done under the name of philosophy. Many sciences have their roots in philosophical debates. Western science began with the pre-Socratics in the 7th century BCE. The pre-Socratics were the first Westerners in recorded history to think about the world using reason instead of myth. Much later, Western science got another big boost from Isaac Newton, 1643 to 1727. Who practiced what was then called natural philosophy and persists to this day as physics. Chemistry also got its start through philosophical inquiry by Newton's contemporary Robert Boyle, 1627 to 1691. In the early 20th century, the philosopher William James, 1842 to 1910, founded the science of psychology. And in the middle of the 20th century, Noam Chomsky, 1928, combined philosophy with linguistics to get the new field of cognitive science started. There are similar origins in the social sciences. Ideals of government and forms of government topics now falling into the category of political science were first theorized by philosophers such as Plato. C. 428 c. 348 BCE, Aristotle, 384 to 322 BCE, Thomas Aquinas. C. 1225 to 1274, Thomas Hobbes, 1588 to 1679, John Locke, 1632 to 1704, and John Stuart Mill, 1806 to 1873. Karl Marx, 1818 to 1883, who is credited with developing the theoretical foundation of communism and socialism, modified the ideas of philosopher George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, 1770 to 1831. The first systematic historian was a philosopher, Giovanni Battista Giambattista, Vico. Also Vigo, 1668 to 1744, as was the first sociologist, the philosophical positivist Auguste Comte. Full name, Isidore Marie Auguste François Xavier Comte, 1798 to 1857. And the philosopher Immanuel Kant, 1724 to 1804, is usually credited with having founded anthropology. In the 20th century, social movements have received valuable inspiration from the work of philosophers. For instance, the women's movement from Simone de Beauvoir, 1908 to 1986, the civil rights movement from W.E.B. Du Bois, 1868 to 1963, the animal rights movement from Peter Singer, 1946. And the environmental preservation movement from Arne Nies, 1912 to 2009, who introduced the term deep ecology.
Was Aquinas able to solve the conflict between faith and reason?
Thomas Aquinas, 1224 to 1274, redefined faith as a kind of knowledge, rather than as a specific feeling or attitude of mind. As such, he said that faith fell between opinion and scientific knowledge. Faith was greater than opinion because it involved strong agreement, as an act of will. And it was less than scientific knowledge because it lacked factual evidence that could compel agreement. Aquinas thought that philosophy was reasoning based on existing knowledge or experience, leading to new knowledge, which he called the way of discovery. He held that philosophy was also the use of reason to confirm beliefs by tracing them back to basic principles, which he called the way of reduction. Philosophy becomes theology if the beliefs one begins with are based on faith. There are, in turn, two kinds of theology: truths in Scripture that are learned for their own sake, and metaphysics or explanations based on religious principles. Despite his theological idea of metaphysics, Aquinas did distinguish between philosophy and theology. For instance, in De Aeternitate Mundi, although he held the religious belief that the universe was not eternal, he said that it might be eternal based on philosophical reasoning. In general, apart from religious revelation, Aquinas believed that we get our knowledge from sense experience and our intellectual understanding of our sense experience. Did St.
What were the new logic and four types of idols made famous by Francis Bacon's Novum Organum?
In his New Atlantis, 1627, Francis Bacon, 1561 to 1626, described a social organization for scientific research. His Novum Organum, 1620, presented a new logic of induction, which would take the place of both Aristotelian logic and a simple collection of facts. The aim was to discover real natural laws or reliable generalizations about aspects of nature. Bacon's system became famous for the obstacles to acquiring such knowledge, which he described as four kinds of idols. First were idols of the tribe or natural tendencies of thought, such as a search for purposes in nature or reading human desires and needs onto natural things and events. The second were the idols of the cave or the idiosyncrasies and biases of individuals due to their education, social background, association, and the authorities they favored. The third type were idols of the marketplace or meanings of words taken for granted when the words themselves did not stand for anything that existed in reality. And, finally, the idols of the theater were the influence of theories that had already been widely accepted.
Why was René Descartes' idea of substance a problem for the empiricists?
According to Descartes, substance was known to the mind, but not through the senses. The empiricists wanted to build knowledge up from information we get through the senses.
How did Max Weber connect Protestantism to capitalism?
Weber observed that capitalism required investment, which itself required an excess of money over what was needed for existence. He believed that such saving was a form of asceticism encouraged in Protestant churches that valorized work and devalued enjoyment of the results of work. Weber noted that other religions dominated in societies that were not capitalistic. Weber called the mental process that made capitalism possible rationalization, and he analyzed its presence in efficient, rule-based Western government, as well as economics. He thought that liberal political systems could be an advantage to nations. Germany, in particular in their international struggles. But he also believed that the accompanying scientific worldview, which downplayed custom, led to a disenchantment of the world. Weber thought that a possible course of correction to the rationalization of bureaucracies was mass democracy, which would result in charismatic leaders.
How were Ludwig Feuerbach's ideas received?
After his early publication of work critical of Christianity, Feuerbach was dismissed from a teaching position at Erlangen University, where he had gotten his doctorate in philosophy. After that, he could not secure further academic employment. His ensuing criticism of Friedrich Hegel, 1770 to 1831, did not help his situation.
What is behaviorism?
Propounded by psychologists Ivan Pavlov, 1859 to 1936, and John Broadus, J. B. Watson, 1878 to 1958, and streamlined by Burhus Frederick, B.F., Skinner, 1904 to 1990. Behaviorism was the thesis that introspection had no use for a science of mind. Behavior is modified by its consequences in ways that can be described without any recourse to the mind in terms of intentions, beliefs, or prior knowledge. Human psychology was no more than behavior that could be observed in the laboratory. Without considering that behavior from the point of view of the subject who was behaving. Learning is conditioning, a series of automatic responses to repetitive rewards and punishment. Watson propounded the theory of behaviorism in his book Behaviorism, 1925. Noam Chomsky's, 1929, review of Skinner's 1959 classic tome Verbal Behavior is taken to have demolished Skinner's behaviorist theory of language learning, and behaviorism more generally. This is important to philosophy in two ways. First, it restores the importance of how things seem or are experienced by a human subject. Second, it allows for speculation and analysis of how what is going on in the subject's mind is organized and processed in the brain.
What did Copernicus mean by the thrice greatest?
Copernicus' phrase "the thrice greatest" was a reference to Hermes Trismegistus, the Greek name of the Egyptian god Thoth, who was credited with healing arts and secret knowledge by Neoplatonists.
What were the common themes of the Enlightenment?
The common themes were a set of values that included the following. Imbuing all other values was the importance of reason and its uses to discover ideal forms of human nature and society. The belief in the natural goodness of man, which was to be rediscovered by the reform of corrupt institutions. An overall secularity and downplaying of traditional Christian transcendence. A new aesthetic and ethics based on the goodness of nature. Perhaps most important, a great faith in progress or the belief that the present is better than the past and that the future will be better than the present. Nevertheless, none of the paramount Enlightenment thinkers simply played out these themes in direct ways. They almost all used reason or rational thought together, with a fair amount of wit to propound and develop their ideas. The ideas themselves, though, sometimes had unforeseen consequences. That is, often the Enlightenment geniuses went too far, or were not able to fully think things through. As a result, skepticism, pessimism, and romantic madness took over when the ideas of progress and the ideals of human reason ran out.
Augustine's role at the beginning of medieval philosophy?
St. Augustine, Aurelius Augustinus, 354–430. Was a pivotal figure in the transition between classical and medieval thought. Some see him as the last of the great classical thinkers, whereas others claim him as the first medieval thinker. He lived through the decline of the Roman Empire, with its political turmoil and military failures, and the Roman state's acceptance of Christianity as the official religion. Just before Augustine died, the Vandals were burning and sacking Hippo, where he was bishop. Augustine's most influential works are Confessions on the Trinity, on Genesis according to the letter, and City of God. They all reflect his own faith after conversion and provide an intellectual structure for much Christian writing that followed. Although Augustine's initial education was in rhetoric, his later studies in Neoplatonism deeply influenced his religious understanding. Still, he approached philosophy in terms of how it could serve religion, rather than as a valuable discipline in its own right. This secondary status of philosophy was widely accepted by philosophers throughout the medieval period. Augustine was one of the early Church Fathers and was canonized as a saint by popular acclaim, as was the custom during the early centuries of the Catholic Church.
Who was Jeremy Bentham?
Jeremy Bentham, 1748–1832, was the founder of the moral system of utilitarianism, which is considered to be one of the three major systems of ethics in Western philosophy, along with Aristotelian virtue ethics and Kantian deontology, or duty ethics.
Who was Friedrich Nietzsche?
Friedrich Nietzsche, 1844–1900, was a brilliant philosophical iconoclast whose devastatingly direct, critical writing style might in itself have qualified him as an existentialist. More substantively, though, was how he developed critiques of bourgeois culture, Christianity, empirical reason, and altruistic morality from the standpoint of a protesting individual who was grander, smarter, more creative, and in odd ways for a much later readership, hipper than those who championed accepted values of the time. While Dostoevsky and others had criticized modernity in the hope of a return to more conservative religious values, Nietzsche looked ahead to coming generations, who would use science as an art to transcend the dreariness of Western history.
Did Aristotle lack a sense of humor?
Aristotle's writing style is magisterial, but his surviving texts are uniformly sober and dry, despite their overall common sense. We can't know what he was like personally, although he was described as having been thin and bald, speaking with a lisp, and displaying a sardonic disposition. When he retired to Chalcis, in the wake of anti-Macedonian reactions in Athens after Alexander died. 325 BCE, he is said to have remarked that he did so lest the Athenians should sin twice against philosophy, a thinly veiled reference to the trial of Socrates.
What is German idealism?
It was the philosophical perspective developed in the 19th century that reality is not physical but psychic, or mental. Its main author was Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, 1770–1831. There were also British and American versions of Hegelian thought.
Who is Jürgen Habermas?
Jürgen Habermas, 1929, is a German philosopher and social theorist who combines the critical theory of the Frankfurt School with American pragmatism. With this combination, he is postmodern in his emphasis on public speech and dialogue as a political way of life. His engagements with contemporary thinkers from Jacques Derrida, 1930 to 2004, to John Rawls, 1921 to 2002, to Pope Benedict XVI, when he was Cardinal Ratzinger, exemplify his theory. However, it should be noted that unlike most avowed postmodern philosophers, Habermas defends Enlightenment democratic values. Habermas' major works include The Structural Transformation of the Public Sphere, 1962, Theory and Practice, 1963, On the Logic of the Social Sciences, 1967, Knowledge and Human Interest, 1967, Toward a Rational Society, 1967, Technology and Science as Ideology, 1968, The Theory of Communicative Action, 1981. On the Pragmatics of Communication, 1992, The Post-National Constellation, 1998, Old Europe, New Europe, Core Europe, 2005, The Divided West, 2006, and with Joseph Ratzinger The Dialectics of Secularization, 2007.
What was original in Jonathan Edwards' view of God?
Jonathan Edwards developed the idea that God loves and is delighted by himself and creates us and other creatures as part of this joy in himself. Edwards taught that God's love is disinterested and that he is supremely beautiful, infusing the entire world with his loveliness. By comparison, the beauty seen by mortals is secondary, an imperfect copy of what God sees.
Who was Isaiah Berlin?
Isaiah Berlin, 1909–1997, was renowned for his work on ideals of liberty in democratic societies. He was born in Latvia and educated at Oxford. He was president of Wolfson College, Oxford, from 1966 to 1975. He is famous for his distinction between positive and negative liberty and his criticism of Marxist ideas of history. Berlin was a brilliant and elegant speaker and delivered lectures on the British Broadcasting Corporation, often without notes. Berlin's major works include Historical Inevitability, Two Concepts of Liberty, 1959. Four Essays on Liberty, 1969, Russian Thinkers, 1978, Against the Current, Essays in the History of Ideas. 1979, Personal Impressions, 1980, The Crooked Timber of Humanity. Chapters in the History of Ideas, 1990, and The Sense of Reality, Studies in Ideas and Their History, 1996.
How did Richard Rorty illustrate relativism to his audience?
Rorty, 1931 to 2007, practiced a highly sophisticated relativism that allowed him to present a position that his audience would agree with, and at the same time show how that position could be plausibly contested by those who held a very different position that was unacceptable to him and his audience. Concerning fundamentalist religious beliefs, for example, he taught views opposed to them with apparent strong commitment, and at the same time tried to show how his perspective was deeply offensive and even counterproductive in changing the minds of those who held those beliefs.
Who was William Whewell?
William Whewell, 1794 to 1866, was a polymath who contributed work to mechanics, mineralogy, geology, astronomy, political economy, theology, education, law, architecture, ethics, the philosophy of science, and what he named ideology. He was a founder and president of the British Association for the Advancement of Science, and a Fellow of the Royal Society. Whewell invented the term scientist analogously with artist. He was the most influential figure in British education in the 19th century.
What are some key facts about Edmund Burke's life?
Edmund Burke was born in Ireland in 1729. He attended Trinity College in Dublin, and then moved to London, hoping to read law, but he was never called to the bar. Instead, he wrote A Vindication of Natural Society and Philosophical Inquiry into Our Ideas on the Sublime and the Beautiful, both published in 1756 by the bookseller Robert Dodley, who also commissioned him to write an abridgment of the history of England, which he never completed. His Vindication was deliberately written in the style of the Tory statesman Lord Bolingbroke. who in overblown ways praised a pure state of nature compared to civilization. Although Burke argued for the opposite. His imitation of Bolingbroke was so convincing that many readers thought Bolingbroke had written it. Burke's theory of art was opposed to the classicist value of clarity. He thought that great art is mysterious and evocative and that the sublime inspires fear. He wrote, "It is our ignorance of things that causes all our admiration and chiefly excites our passions."
What was Franz Brentano's main contribution to empirical psychology?
Brentano's lasting importance lies in his emphasis on the intentionality of conscious states and attitudes. He pointed out that thoughts, beliefs, hopes, desires, and the like which Bertrand Russell 1872–1970, was to term propositional attitudes are directed toward some object. For instance, if you are thinking about an apple, then your intentional object is the apple you are thinking about. If you want a new car, it is the car you intend as an object of that desire. Because physical states are not intentional in this way. Intentionality is a basis on which what is mental can be distinguished from what is physical. Brentano identified three different kinds of intending: ideas, judgments, and the phenomena of love and hate. The last, also known as emotions and volitions, are directly related to morality. Although an earlier version of Brentano's doctrine called immanent intentionality suggested that the object intended was in some way literally in the mind. He later explained that although there is always a mental object for consciousness, the object need not literally exist. The point is that one can think of a thing that does not exist. Objects of thought that do exist have strict relations with other objects that exist, whereas those that do not exist lack them.
Who were the key players in the theories and practice of them in the scientific revolution?
Some of the key players of the scientific revolution were Nicolaus Copernicus, 1473–1543, Ptolemy, 90–168 c. E., who was not of this period, but highly relevant to it, Galileo Galilei, 1564–1642, Johannes Kepler, 1571–1630, Francis Bacon, 1561–1626, Robert Boyle, 1627–1691, and Isaac Newton, 1643–1727.
What was William James' pragmatic epistemology?
He accepted that statements are true or false claims about what exists. But within our experience the world is really malleable, so that truth is also imposed on reality. Truth, as agreement with reality, varies, depending on the nature of what may be true. For example, in ordinary experience, beliefs are true if we are not painfully surprised when we act on them. Scientific truth emerges in ways that make entire systems coherent.
Who was George Herbert Mead?
George Herbert Mead, 1863 to 1931, was a philosopher, social theorist, and reformer whom John Dewey, 1859 to 1952, described as a seminal mind of the first order. Dewey brought him to the University of Chicago when he accepted his position there. Mead had been raised in a New England Puritan community, but in his mature thought he became an empiricist. Mead's most important contribution to both pragmatic theories of education and sociology was his idea of symbolic interaction. He offered an explanation of the development of the human mind and self through the development of language and role-playing. Although something of a behaviorist in his insistence on the social nature of individual mental development, Mead also believed that there were different developmental stages of adjustment to the external environment. Mead worked with Dewey in the Chicago Laboratory School and was a friend of Jane Addams. 1860 to 1935, and a close observer of her work at Hull House.
What aspects of Dostoevsky's life influenced his deep interest in human difficulty?
Dostoevsky's father was a violent and abusive alcoholic. He was also the doctor of the Mariinsky Hospital for the Poor in Moscow. Dostoevsky himself suffered from epilepsy from the age of 9. As a child, he used to disobey his parents and explore Mariinsky Hospital. Absorbed by the misery of the patients and the stories about their lives that they told him. His first book, Poor Folk, 1846, brought out the individual humanity of the poor, who were otherwise be ignored and dismissed by the educated reading public of the time. In 1849 Dostoevsky was arrested for his participation in the liberal group of intellectuals called the Petrashevsky Circle. He was sentenced to death. Although Tsar Nicholas II did not really intend for the execution to be carried out. Nevertheless, the experience of standing for hours in the freezing cold in anticipation of a firing squad was believed to have scared Dostoevsky for life. He was then exiled to Siberia for 4 years of hard labor. He wrote of this period, in summer, intolerable closeness, in winter, unendurable cold. All the floors were rotten. Filth on the floors an inch thick. One could slip and fall. We were packed like herrings in a barrel. Fleas, lice, and black beetles by the bushel. When Dostoevsky's brother and wife died in the same year, he fell into a deep depression and became a gambler. During that period he wrote Crime and Punishment, 1866, in a frenzied haste, because he was out of money. His life evened out after 1867, when he married his 20-year-old stenographer to whom he had dictated The Gambler, 1867. While this book is about an elderly woman who gambles self-destructively, some think that Dostoevsky was describing his own compulsion. Dostoevsky lived at the Russian resort Syria for years before his death. From emphysema and an epileptic seizure that brought on a lung hemorrhage. 40,000 people went to his funeral.
How is sociology related to philosophy?
Social and political philosophers discuss society and criticize culture. Sociology is the science that can give them factual information about what they are discussing.
What was logical atomism?
The main claim of logical atomists was that the world is made up of logical facts. These logical facts are like atoms because they can't be divided into smaller facts. Single logical facts can be combined by truth-functional logic into molecular facts. To apply the theory of logical atomism to more complex statements, such as the claims of science, the method of logical construction was posited. In logical construction, any S represents a logical construction of PS if statements about S can be reduced to atomic statements about PS. For example, a salad is a logical construction of its ingredients. And perceptions of ordinary objects are logical constructions of sense data. Bertrand Russell, 1872–1970, and Ludwig Wittgenstein, 1889–1951, were the main proponents of this perspective.